Please allow me to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Nadia Paran is a cultural anthropologist, writer, educator, and creative strategist. Her work is grounded in empathy and human-centered design principles. She helps individuals and communities to see the world with new perspectives and to create and implement holistic solutions. Nadia, welcome.
Thanks so much, Alistair. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad that you could come. Next slide. So I won't read over all of these, but if you're wondering, what is it exactly that you're going to get from this webinar today, here's a list of things that we will be going through. Obviously, it's about creating personas. And so we're going to be talking about what these personas are, how can you create them. I want to draw attention just to number 6. So we will have time at the end for questions, a bit of group discussion. If you have questions as I'm going along, feel free to write them into the chat. There will be a recording of this event, and I think the slides could be shared as well. Karen, yeah, great question. And we'll have time for more questions of the content at the end. So please make sure that you note down any questions you have, because we would love to be able to address them together. All right, but we'll dive right in. So next slide. So we're talking about what personas are. And the first thing that I want to do when I teach about personas, I like to ask people, have you ever even heard the term persona before? And you could write a simple yes or no into the chat. But if it's a yes, I'm wondering, how would you explain what a persona is in just 1 or 2 sentences, maybe even just a few words? I'll give you 30 seconds for that. I'd love to see where people's understanding is currently when we're talking about personas. So go ahead and write something in the chat. It could be a simple yes or no. The question is, have you heard the term persona before? Seeing some yeses, seeing some nos. Yeah, and I'd be curious, yeah, who are you talking to when you're writing copy, etc. Yeah, this is often what people can think of if they've heard the word persona. Next slide. So sometimes when people think about persona, depending on especially what you studied, if you've studied philosophy, you might be thinking of Carl Jung's archetypes. That's not what we're referring to. If you're a gamer, which I'm not, so I don't know how to draw on this more, you might be thinking of the video game personas. Where I'm speaking about personas comes from the area of user experience research, or UX research, and applied anthropology. So as Alistair mentioned, I'm an applied anthropologist, I did a PhD. And when we're speaking about personas as far as applied anthropology goes, what we're talking about are fictional representations of real people in your community. Okay, so user experience research is looking at users, but we could actually replace this and say that we're looking at community members. I know a lot of you are community builders, community managers in different contexts from different sectors. So we could go ahead and replace user research with community member research. So again, they're fictional representations, but of real people. And the reason why they're real people is so important is that personas are ideally based off of quite a bit of qualitative research. And I'm going to be talking about the qualitative research in more detail soon. When you're developing a persona or multiple personas, you want to aim for somewhere between 3 and 7. The idea being if you only have 2, then you've probably not actually segmented your community into enough people. You've swept people into a category that you maybe need a little more micro division there. If you have more than 7, you probably will have too much on your plate. Or we could push that to 8 maybe. But if you have, if you have 10, let's say, personas, there's going to be too much for you to be juggling and thinking through. The reason being is that we use personas to actually help us in the job that we're doing. So personas can help us design an experience, which I'll talk more about soon, to actually meet the needs of individuals. So you can imagine if you're having 10 or 20 different personas in mind, you're going to be way too overloaded. You're not actually going to use that information to help you in your role. Okay, next slide. So when we're looking at personas, we're looking beyond sociodemographic data. So if you're already segmenting your community members into different groups, you might be thinking about, okay, what are their ages or where do they live? A few other kind of like a fact sheet about them. That is included in personas, but personas go a lot deeper than just that sociodemographic data. So when we're looking at personas, and I have an example here on the right, which is a persona used by Spotify to divide up their listeners into different types of people. We've got a key identity for this persona. So they've given her a name, which is a common practice when building personas. They've also given her, an identity below that name, casual audiophile. But then we have different things that we look at when we're developing a persona. So you're going far beyond the segmentation used when you're doing sociodemographic data. You're looking at what drives this person, what motivates them, where do they encounter challenges, and how do they respond when they have a challenge in their life, in their community member context, in their workplace, etc. You also ask, who are the people who are influencing this person? Where or how do they spend their time? The reason being this is, especially if you're in communications, let's say you're in the marketing department or you're otherwise involved in creating communications to push out to your members, you want to know how to reach that person. Do you find them by email? Is that the most common way that they will read your message? Is it going to be on Twitter? Is it going to be on LinkedIn? Is it going to be on Facebook, etc.? You also want to understand their digital literacy, which there's a lot of interesting research coming out about this that I can't get into in such a short presentation. But digital literacy and how comfortable someone is with media is a really important part as well of understanding persona. So we're going to go into more of this as we get into our group exercise, but I'm just trying to lay the groundwork to help you understand, okay, what are the things we think about beyond social demographic data when we're thinking through a persona? Next slide. So why do we need them? Why do we need to go beyond social demographic data? One way of explaining this is that everything we do is an experience. And a couple of slides up, I said that a persona is used in order to help us design experiences. And depending on how familiar you are with experience design or design anthropology or a number of other phrases like that, human-centered design, hearing the term designing an experience might have a different level of familiarity for you. So how I want to explain it to you is that absolutely everything that we do for other people is an experience that we are offering them, and we are implicitly designing it for them. So for example, even this webinar that you've come to, me and my team had to think about, okay, how do we want to design this for them? What time of the day should it be at? Should we have visuals? What kind of information should we include on the slide? What amount of time should we devote to guided exercises versus us delivering information? All of that is an experience that we invite people to, right? And the reality is, and you'll all know this from your own lives, everyone has limited time and limited energy, and those are finite resources. We can't get more of them. So when we're trying to engage other people into our community contexts, we have to make sure that the experience we offer them is one that is going to feel good and relevant and satisfying and fulfilling, because otherwise they will choose option A or B or C over the option that you are offering them. Okay, we all have so many invitations coming into our inboxes. We all have so many things we could be spending our time with, that we need to make sure that the experience we offer to people is good, relevant, satisfying, fulfilling. But the catch is, and this is why you need personas, not everyone wants that same experience. Okay, so we can't just design one perfect experience and hope that it will meet everyone's needs, because humans do not work that way. And I could speak for ages about this from cultural anthropology. Anthropologists are all about understanding individuals and how they work in systems. We do not all want the same experience. And that's why we need to have these 3 to 7 different persona types. It would be lovely to interact with each individual as an individual. But unfortunately, almost no organization could have time for that. So at the very least, we need to group them by their persona types, because that will affect the strategy you create. It will affect the communications that you roll out, the timing of that, the events you offer, all sorts of things that you do for your community. Okay, so that's why we need personas. There's another way I could explain it. So if we go to the next slide. This is an example of social demographic data. We've added in interests here, which is not always included, but sometimes it is. But we've got here two different people who I will reveal soon, okay? You'll note they have the same age range, the same occupation. They are both Ivy League degree educated. They have the similar interests of technology, startups, even basketball they share. Okay, and we might think if we were looking at these two people as their social demographic data, we might think, okay, we should offer them the same community experience. But if we go to the next slide, the grand reveal, okay, these are the two people. This on the left is Mark Zuckerberg. On the right, it's our own CEO of Illuminati, Daniel Watts. Daniel didn't know that I was doing this. Hope you like having your photo in here, Dan. The question that we would have to ask when we're doing personas, and I can say from knowing Daniel quite well and knowing Mark through what I read in the news about him, that these two people actually have very different values. They would have very different ways of engaging in a community. They would have different needs, they would have different motivations, they would have different pain points, different people or different goals are influencing them. And that would mean that the way that we create a community experience for these two people would actually be entirely different. Okay, so the fact that they had that same social demographic data, it could have lended us toward going, okay, they're going to have the same experience. But when we dig a little deeper, when we look at values, pain points, motivations, et cetera, all the personal stuff behind personas, we would realize actually we need to deliver a very different community experience. So that's another way to illustrate the why behind personas. Next slide, please. So of course, there are different ways of how we can create these personas. And I wish I could go into a lot of depth here. I've given a different webinar for Illuminati about 6 months ago, which was about empathy, cognitive empathy or perspective taking. We'll drop the link in the chat in case you haven't seen it and you want to. I go into a lot more detail there about empathy. I'm only able to touch on it briefly here. But basically, on the left here, we see, okay, this is what your team, or you, depending on how big your organization is, this is what you would want to understand about your community members. Yes, you would have the demographic data. Of course, that is included. We don't neglect it. We just dig deeper. We look at needs and goals, pain points, values, behavioral patterns, the defining characteristics, the motivations. And the way that we learn this is basically cognitive empathy, which is also called perspective taking, or figuratively stepping into the shoes of someone else, trying to see the world the way they see it, trying to live out life through their eyes, so to speak. But the nuts and bolts of how we do that, there are many different ways. And I've listed them here on the far right in no particular order. But these are all methods that we take from qualitative research, which again is my background. There are many different ways depending on their resourcing, that means the time and the money that your team has. You could choose different ones of these. And they would have different timelines behind them. They would require different skill sets. And they would offer you different insights as well. The insights that we can get from a survey are very different than the insights we get from doing ethnographic work, for example. Next slide. And the reason why it's so important that we use this qualitative research, if you remember back from one of the earlier slides, I said that personas are fictional representations of real people, and that the way you understand this is based off of qualitative research. Unfortunately, we can't really do this as an internal team brainstorm exercise only. An internal team brainstorm can give lots of good results. But the thing is at the end of the day, we are not the people who we are designing a community for. They are different than us, right? So they have different needs. So there's actually this whole process behind doing user research. I've outlined it very briefly here. It starts by realizing the problem, defining the objective, and from there you go on to have this whole method that you go through behind actually doing the research, carrying out the study, analyzing it, and actually changing the way your community experiences based on the insights you gathered. And this is why it's so important to use qualitative research rather than just to try to figure it all out in your own heads. It's a good starting point. It's not an ending point to figure things out internally. Next slide. So what I'd like to do, and this is before I bring my colleague Becky into our conversation, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you to reflect here. Again, the list is on the left now, different types of options that you and your team could do based on the resourcing you have. But I'd like you to reflect through these questions on the right. So you might even drop into the chat. I'd be interested, really genuinely interested to know if there are any of these methods that you and your team have already done. Or maybe there are methods that your team plans to do in the future. Maybe it's something you've got lined up for the new year, et cetera, et cetera. But I'd like you to think through these questions because they are the ones that you would have to think through to know which method to select. So you could think through, okay, well, what skills does your team have to carry these out? You know, do you have someone who can facilitate a focus group session and analyze that data after you hear from people? What kind of time frame do you have? Do you need to figure this out by next month, or do you have a little longer? Did you have to figure it out yesterday? Thinking about resourcing, skill sets, timeline. These are the questions that I'd love you to reflect on, or that I would invite you rather to reflect on. And they might come up a bit more at our final Q&A. Okay, next slide. So I'd like to now invite my colleague Becky to come join me. Becky is, of course, the Vice President of Marketing and US Partnerships here at Illuminati. Before she joined us at Illuminati, she was actually working at the Coca-Cola company, and she was responsible for deploying the alumni program there. So we're going to ask some questions of Becky as a kind of case study for us to learn about personas and how it actually worked in the workplace context. So I don't know, Becky, if you could just say hi to people.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to join and talk about this today. So I think there'll be a lot of great sharing.
Yeah, great. So the first question that I would have is, Becky, if you could walk us through, like, what was it in 2018? I think I've got the date right there. What was it in 2018 that made the Coca-Cola company want to even create an alumni program? We can start there and then we'll slowly get into the personas behind it.
Yeah, sure. And it's funny because when I was at Coke, I had not heard of alumni previous to that, and was asked to lead the future strategy there. And honestly, it was a lot of, as you see the names on here and a lot of the organizations that you see on this slide, is that we were starting to hear a lot of noise and chatter around other organizations that had been doing this for years and really seeing a value. You know, P&G has been doing it for a really long time. They are actually their own separate nonprofit entity, fully funded by their alumni. So we had started to really see a lot of a lot of these other organizations that were developing alumni and seeing true value. Many of them were doing it for, to stay connected to the talent and kind of pull people back in, that boomerang employee. A lot of people even put a dollar amount to that employee when they bring it back in. It's a cost savings to the organization. And, so we were, starting to see this. I reached out to many of these folks when I, started this journey in the alumni space at Coca-Cola to try to understand kind of what worked, what didn't, why were they doing this? And, they really felt that, one could say that the employee life cycle starts even before they come into the organization. But then I think, we could all say that it doesn't stop when they leave. So I think it's really about understanding that journey. And a lot of these organizations were seeing that value of bringing people back in. And also, it also ranges, some were including current employees as well in that bucket of people that they called into their community. And so all the strategies are very different. But again, a lot of benefits to, why companies were doing this. And again, a lot of these folks I leaned on as I started to form our future strategy as well.
That's great. Thanks for that answer. It's a helpful way to contextualize, why you then designed the alumni program in the way that you did. I wonder if you could also walk us through what was the state of things for the Coke community at the time that you were pivoting and realizing, okay, we need to build, a different type of alumni community.
Yeah, at the time we were engaging with retirees in the States. Retirees are a big population of folks that have left the organization that you continue to stay engaged with. At Coke, we were really only forming relationships with retirees for the most part. And so we saw an opportunity to expand that and look at anyone that had left the organization. So that's really, we kind of categorize those as retirees, the C-suite, like any CEOs or senior level executives, and then also the general population. So pretty much anyone that worked at the company and left. What we had seen was on Facebook, LinkedIn, all these different social channels, there was a lot of engagement happening, but we as an organization were not part of that chatter and also engagement. People were having lunch, people were networking, getting together for events. But again, we weren't part of that. And we felt that there was a huge missed opportunity in not being a part of that. So I think that's where we looked at all the different benefits there were as part of, staying engaged. And that's brand advocacy. Again, as I alluded to earlier, it's the talent rehire and bringing those people back into the company. Some organizations, as on the slide previously, were also saw value with, business development, staying connected for future opportunities and other channels to staying connected. And we saw that as well at Coke, is that, some of these folks would leave the company and actually become customers of ours. And so there was a lot of different reasons why Coke wanted to expand. And so that's kind of why we navigated that space and started to really see the value. The other thing here, as you see on this slide, is Glassdoor ratings, all these different reasons why companies would continue to stay engaged with people. Those were many of the benefits that we saw also at Coca-Cola. So
that's really helpful to hear. We've got some questions showing up in the chat. Feel free to everyone to keep writing questions in the chat. We'll see if we can bring them in. Otherwise, we will have time at the end as well. So Becky, one thing I want to ask then is, okay, once you knew that you wanted to create this alumni community and you wanted to kind of pivot away from just being retirees, networking to something different, how did you and your team actually then go about informing your strategy? So you knew you wanted to make the alumni community. Where did you go from there?
Yeah, so we actually pulled in a consulting agency, Sparks Grove, formerly North Highland, and we wanted to understand, what does our community want? Like if we were to form this, my boss at Coke always used to say, if we're going to set the ship in a direction, let's make sure the direction is going, the sail is going in the right direction and that we're not course correcting. So we really wanted to stop, do the appropriate research, understand our community, understand kind of some of the challenges that we were facing, like outlined here. We had an opportunity to expand the community. Again, as I alluded to, we were only talking to those retirees. We also, the experience wasn't a good one. People were leaving the company and, we weren't really engaging with them. So it was, there was an opportunity to, improve that engagement and then also evolve and, offer different offerings and really create meaningful reasons to stay engaged. And so we brought this company in and we actually went out and surveyed and interviewed and talked to current employees, former employees and our retirees, and really understood what were the needs of the community, how were they vastly different, how all of these people and the way they wanted to engage in the community, what their needs were very different. And so we had to understand and stop and truly understand what those were before we designed the strategy. And honestly, everything that we did moving forward, though, really linked back to, those needs and understanding of the community. So it was crucial that we did that work in the upfront, for sure.
Can you walk us through some of the insights that were gleaned from bringing in that consultant team and doing the insight study? Like what were some of the things that you and your team learned?
Yeah, so we really saw three different reasons, and I'll get into the personas in a second. But from what we saw in those personas is we saw three very specific pillars that we were really centered on, and it was, a sense of belonging, personal and professional enrichment, and then giving back to the community and making community impact. So when we developed the strategy, it was really centered on those three areas. So it was around, sense of belonging, personal and professional enrichment, and community impact. So everything we did, even with the comm strategy, events, everything linked back to those three pillars. And if it didn't, we didn't do it. So it was really kind of the funnel of, okay, like level setting expectations and like just double checking with us is that if it doesn't roll up to those three areas, we shouldn't be doing it. So it was something that really kind of kept us grounded in what's important to the community. Obviously, the business needs are a whole other discussion, but from the community's perspective, those were the three areas that we really had to make sure we stayed laser focused on to ensure that we were meeting the needs of our community.
Yeah, and I think that actually answers one of the questions that has come up in the chat about, who is kind of getting more support or more benefits from having a program like this. Is it the company? Is it the alumni themselves? And I think the answer, as you just said, is like the company actually can't get any benefits unless it is offering good benefits and good reasons of engagement to the alumni. So it's rather than try to figure out like who's kind of getting more, I think we can say it will only actually work if you keep those organization needs in mind. Of course, you have to keep those in mind, but you're designing the entire experience based on what people need, what they want, what their motivations are. Otherwise, if we jump back to what I was saying earlier, you won't get them through the door because we all have limited time and energy and resources. So it's got to,
it's a healthy balance because obviously, as everyone knows on this call, we have to ensure that the ROI is there and that the company or university, that we're seeing, the ROI. But again, it won't happen if your community is not engaged, obviously. So
yeah, exactly. So I see, we've got a slide here with different personas in front of us. I'd love it if you could actually walk us through like who are these personas, like introduce us to them, tell us about them.
Yeah. So as I alluded to earlier, is we've really had those three pillars. So the sense of belonging, personal and professional enrichment, and global impact. And really, it came down, and we really identified those is as you started to look across these personas, there were commonalities that we saw when we interviewed, the current employees, past employees, and retirees. And, relationship builder is someone that really wants to stay engaged. They want to create those meaningful relationships with people. The do-gooder might be someone that wants to go in and they want to make an impact in their community. They want to give back. Go-getter could be the person that really wants to do that personal and professional enrichment. And so it's understanding all of the different needs across the community and then designing, again, events. How do we make sure that the do-gooder has volunteer opportunities in their community to give back that, is obviously linked to the company, but also allows them to kind of do good in their community. The brand champion might be someone where we can bring them back in for focus groups, or, they're heavily focused on helping us as a company, and they'll do anything to be that brand ambassador. So how do we look at opportunities to continue to stay engaged with them and, kind of fill that need that they have as well? Relationship builder, how do we look at network opportunities and, events to kind of connect people, mentoring, different ways that they can continue to engage. So, and then you're going to have the pragmatists that also, they just want to be informed. They just want to get the newsletter. Other than that, just stay me, keep me informed. But I'm not one that's going to go to events. I'm not one that's going to do, too much. But I definitely want to stay kind of a high level overview of information. So I think again, it's finding that balance of how do we understand our community, understand all these personas, and then design that strategy that ensures that we're meeting all the needs. So, and this is just, a lot of the things that we learned, and we definitely had some of these aha moments of, oh my gosh, I never thought of this. How do we make sure that we meet, those needs that we really didn't think about before? And so it can definitely shift your strategy as well. So I think it's definitely important that you are listening to your community, whether it be through surveys, again, focus groups, research, interviews, all the different things that Nadia outlined. But it's definitely a crucial step in the process for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Becky.
Yeah.
And, knowing a little bit about who's in the audience, like I know that many of you are in higher ed contexts. You might be thinking of alumni, you might be thinking of students, but one thing I always ask people to do is, even before we get to the level of personas, like how can you break down the groups that you currently have into smaller groups? So if you're thinking, okay, I work with undergraduate students, well, how are they different from each other, right? Even then, you've got people who are first generation. You've got people who are have different levels of interest in the academic side of university. And I say that as a professor who experiences that in my students, right? People who are there more for the career path versus learning knowledge versus they're really there for the sports team or whatever, right? All of the students who you have in your student context are going to have different ways of identifying. They will have different values, they will have different motivations. So even before we get to the level of personas, you can just begin to think, okay, who are the people in my community? And how could I break the groups that I currently have for them into slightly smaller groups, right? A lot of this is about segmentation. Thanks so much, Becky, for sharing from the corporate sector experience. It's really helpful to kind of have that. Great, thank you. I was just about to ask you for that next slide. You read my mind. So what we're going to do, and I'm looking at our time, I'm really happy with how this is flowing along. We're going to have time for Q&A. What we're going to do now is I want you to have a few moments to think through the personas who are in your community context, all right? So one way you can do this, again, with the caveat that personas should be made, they should be based off of substantial qualitative research, but in the meantime, we can do this one small exercise, okay? It's not going to be perfect, it's not going to be complete, but it's going to be a step in the right direction. So what I want you to do is I want you to think of someone in your community context who you have recently interacted with. Okay, maybe you sent them an email, or maybe they showed up at your event, some form of interaction that you have had with them. And I want you to begin starting by listing their sociodemographic data, because again, we don't exclude that from personas, we just dive deeper. So I want you to think, okay, age, education level, work experience, if that's applicable, geography, especially if your community that you deal with is multinational, cross nations, etc. Where are they living? Other kind of demographic data, if it's applicable, could be things like job type or salary range, etc. But I want you to start by listing the demographics, and you can pull up a piece of paper or a new document, etc. It'll be helpful for you to actually do this exercise rather than just kind of think it through in your head. But after you've listed the demographic data, I want you to try to push yourself beyond that. And you could take any of these questions. We're not going to take the time to go through them all in this webinar, but you'll have this slide, you can return to it later. But I want you to dive a little deeper into the personal element behind this person who you've interacted with recently. You might think about them, okay, what would they want? And this is the question I always start with when we're doing cognitive empathy, when we're doing perspective taking. Get into their shoes for a little bit. Why would they want to be a part of the community that you are offering? You might know what you want from them, We usually know that when we're in community building. You're like, oh, well, I want them to show up as a mentor. I'm hoping that they will not be flaky, et cetera, et cetera. But what do they want? And it's really important that we start there. So we're not going to take too long. I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds, but write it into the chat if you'd like, or even now is a time where you could unmute yourself. You could speak it into the group. It could be a helpful group brainstorm. But I want you to think of this one person who you've interacted with. And I want you to try to dive beyond their social demographic data, looking at either one of these questions from needs and goals, or ways of communicating, or the roles, any of these questions. I'll give you a little bit of time to think through that. And it won't be a test. I won't make you share it, but there'll be an opportunity to share if you want. But first take a minute, brainstorm it through. Okay, so now I'd invite you, okay, yeah, I've got, some people are writing into the chat. I'd also invite you to you can unmute, you can speak up. We can have a bit of time to turn this into a group brainstorm, chat or audio. If anyone would like to share what they've learned or what they've brainstormed about a need or a goal, technical and communication pattern or role, etc. Who is the person behind your persona? What do they need from you? If anyone would like to share. Yeah, someone who wants to be able to manage a large group, but struggles with having the right resources. Yeah, this is a persona type of within the umbrella of community manager, right? Perhaps even some people identify with this. They're like, that is me. The judge, decision maker. Jill, I'd invite you to say a little bit more about either of these if you'd like. What kind of qualities or needs do you know about the decision maker or the deal maker? Or we could even take this question one step back. Another one, yeah, good intentions. They want to get involved, but they have no idea how to start. Yeah, I think a lot of people in community environments fall into this persona type. And then our job as a community manager is to think, okay, well, how do we meet that person where they're at? What resources would they need from us? The ability to listen, the ability to discern the needs. Relationship building. Yeah, and I'd be interested as well. One thing that we could do if we jump to the next slide, not that we're leaving this exercise behind, we'll keep thinking through it, but these are some ways that we can distinguish personas from each other. Okay, and these are going to differ quite a bit depending on the sector you're in. One of the challenges that we have in this webinar is we know that audience members are from many different sectors. We don't have just one sector in front of us. So this will change depending on who your community members are. But you could begin to think about, okay, what stage of life are they in? For example, if you work with alumni, if someone left your organization or institution a year ago, they're in a pretty different stage of life than if they left 25 years ago. They're both categorized as alumni, but they would have very different needs. They would probably have pretty different purchasing powers. They might have different things that they would want from that community. If we jump to the bottom there, the needs and the wants. Yeah, listening is crucial, but also getting at the thoughts behind what is said. Yeah, I agree with that. Steve, if you wanted to say anything more about that, go for it. But how I'm reading that is, yeah, when we're trying to figure out people's what they want from us, we need to listen to them, but also understand more than just what they're saying, right? Are there any other points? And we could jump back one slide actually. Are there any other points from these questions that anyone, if we go just backward actually, to this one, thank you. I'd be curious when you were thinking of the person who you had in mind, and especially if you're able to think of what do they want from my community experience. I know that most of you, not all of you, but many of you are community builders, community managers, you're trying to grow a community of people. What is it that people want from you? Again, you know what you want from them, probably, but what is it that they want from you? And then if you were, for the fun of it, to think of a second person, maybe who's quite different than the first one. And if you were to begin thinking through, okay, well, what does this person want and need from a community experience? Maybe one student is coming for mentorship and a different student is coming to network for their career. Those might seem similar motivations, but they actually could be quite different, and they could have an experience designed for them that would be quite different. Does anyone want to share anything about what this persona type might want from you and from your community? I know it's semi-awkward being put on the spot in these webinars. Okay,
I've been keeping myself slightly muted just because I've got a really terrible raspy voice today, I'm afraid. But I'll throw something into the mix if that's all right, and then everyone can sort of help give me a steer, I suppose. I got reached out directly by an alumni of ours who left having done a master's in music. He reached out to me a couple of weeks ago, and it started off with a fairly direct complaint in that he felt fairly isolated from the university and it hadn't been approached to share his knowledge, and that where he'd studied his original degree had been a lot more kind of forthcoming with him and inviting him back and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose my thinking along the persona line was identifying those kind of people who maybe expect to be asked for things, to sort of share their knowledge and those kind of things, and putting them into a sort of ambassador camp, maybe, where they can start to lead groups of specific knowledge.
Yeah. Could you say a bit more about, like, asking them to lead specific knowledge? Where were you going with that?
Yes. So one of the things he was interested in doing was mentoring, and obviously we'll be running sort of mentoring opportunities. So whether there's much need for his specific music learning, but perhaps we could bring him in sort of across the board as a mentor in other areas, and just trying to sort of find maybe those cross-pollination opportunities for him. Yeah, that's what I was thinking anyway.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I'd be, I hope I know we'll have a chance to talk more soon, Will, so I look forward to hearing more kind of how you're thinking through that. Very good. Anyone else? I know another benefit for everyone in the audience is learning from more than just me, right? We've got experts all in the audience who have different experience points that, you know, others I know would be happy to learn from. So if anyone else would like to share, please go for it. I'm seeing more in the chat here. Okay, so if we could jump 2 slides forward, Becky, thank you. I want to return to this slide, which we showed to you earlier. And again, now having a little more context that you can think of for your personas, what I'd like to invite you again to reflect on, okay, you know now, hopefully a little bit more than you did before about personas, the importance of them, some of the tools that we can use in order to understand them. I'd like you to, again, and this is a slide that you could take into a team meeting or have further reflection on after this webinar finishes, but I'd like to just invite you again to reflect on, okay, of these methods, again, the left side are the methods of how we figure out personas. The brainstorm activity that we just did, it's a great starting point, but as you've probably experienced, it can be quite hard to just think through all of that in our heads. Even if you are trained in cognitive empathy skills, it can still be very challenging to just pull it out of thin air, so to speak. We need that qualitative research piece in order to get the data, to get the insights that we can then analyze and apply changes from. But I'd like to ask you to think through, okay, which of these, and again, you could think, which have we already done as a team? And what did we learn from doing those methods in that way? But what else might we do in the future? Some of these can be done with very little resourcing. And I'm available if anyone wants to write to me, either to have a quick conversation or for some tool sharing or something more in depth. I'm available to kind of give some of my own expertise from these different methods. But I'd like you to first think, okay, what can your team do? What do you have internally that your team could carry out? Again, what time frame do you have? You could also think about the willingness of your community members to give you their time. All of my colleagues who work as anthropologists across companies are noticing that very few people want to fill out surveys anymore. You might have experienced the survey fatigue yourself over the COVID pandemic. Lots of surveys are thrown our way. They're not necessarily going to be answered. So that also affects the methods we can choose. Are people in our community actually willing to participate in the ways we want to invite them to? What depth can your team go to for analyzing this data? It's always unfortunate if you run this great study and then no one can actually analyze it and no one can make sense of it. No one can turn it into a strategy or designing a new comms plan or whatever other application. So bring this slide to your next team meeting. Could be a helpful thing for you all to think through together. But we'll have the remaining time for any other questions that are left. Otherwise, we can finish before the hour, of course, but either myself or Becky are happy for you to contact us. Our emails are, if we go to the next slide, our emails are here. You can take note of them. You can find us on LinkedIn. Maybe we can drop, thank you. Yeah, I was just gonna say we can drop our LinkedIns in the chats as well. Do take a look at my empathy webinar if you're wanting more detail on the cognitive empathy or the perspective taking that I mentioned earlier. I go into a lot more detail in that webinar.